But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit more about Harvard with you because it's, as an institution, one is kind of representative of all of these elite colleges that churn out what we refer to as our ruling class, whether you like it or not. But also, we've got a lot of problems as a result of, especially recent Harvard grads. I was looking at Massachusetts. I mentioned yesterday that both the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Boston, Harvard grads. And Massachusetts is one of the number one states in the country to flee right now, according to moving companies. And Boston, man, that mayor, she's destroying the city, and she's throwing Christmas parties for anybody but white people. She thought that she'd be able to get away with that. That'd be fine. Just no whites allowed Christmas parties. Oh, my goodness. For more on this, we bring in Chris Bedford. He's an expert on Boston, Massachusetts, Harvard, and so many other things. He's the executive editor of the Common Sense Society magazine, and he joins us now. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Vince. I don't know how much time I spent in Harvard, but I know I drank quite a few beers on and near the campus when I was in high school. Generally problematic behavior.
What did you learn from Harvard during those formative moments?
I learned that they had some good concerts in and around the area. But you're right. Harvard is a place that has enjoyed really just incredible esteem from the American people for centuries. It's the oldest college in the United States, founded well before the founding of the United States, and it had an illustrious future ahead of it at that time of kind of training up the American leaders, the leadership class. But that reputation's long been overdue for reevaluation. And I've actually really enjoyed, even though they've been rather ugly spectacles, the last few months of the American people and the donors and even the graduates of Harvard who may have had rose-colored blinders on or crimson-colored in this case, to look back and say, holy smokes, where did all this hatred come from? Where is this, like, it might be normal to see pro-Palestinian activism on college campus, but where do we get pro-Hamas?
Yes.
That seems like a stretch. Or to look at the president of Harvard, Miss Gay, out there publicly defending this stuff, and then having it turn out that she's got a rather shoddy academic record herself, calling everyone racist, refusing to take credit for these things. They got to look at that and say, well, there's a real problem here. And when you look at Claudine Gay and you look at her tenure at Harvard, well, she's the shortest ruling president of the university in its entire history. It's a very long history. So you can't even really blame her. She's much more a product of a rot that's at that university, and one that I really hope people continue to pay attention to when these first rounds of headlines fade.
You talk about the history of Harvard. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Harvard start as a seminary school? They trained clergy, and in some sense, they're training a new type of clergy these days, aren't they?
Yes, it did start as a Protestant seminary school. I actually learned that from my grandfather, who was a working-class guy in Cambridge. They used to pray for their Catholic classmates who'd gone to battle Protestant Harvard. But I bet those guys had a pretty lucrative future ahead of them.
Yes.
Yeah, they do train a new class, and the same people who are up there right now, these radical professors, these people who have shoddy academic records, like the president herself, these people who cover up, they're the ones who decide who the next round of elites are. They're the ones who are filling these Harvard graduates right now with hate. And it's not just like there's a bunch of Hamas operatives sneaking around Harvard University saying you must fight Jewish people. It actually comes from the diversity, equity, inclusion, and the identity politics stuff that the Israeli conflict just fits too neatly into in these minds. They've laid a groundwork where they say that this is a philosophical way of looking at the world, the oppressor versus oppressed. This is the correct way to view history.
Yes.
And the Israeli conflict has happened to be a casualty of that, something that really just fit into it. And I actually liked Bill Ackerman's tweets on this today. He's a major donor to Harvard, a billionaire, an alumni, saying, hey, this is a lot bigger than simple anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is just another one of the symptoms of the things that this major American accreditor is teaching to the next generation of rulers.
Well, this type of thinking is why the left is outraged today, and that includes Claudine Gay, about the circumstances of her resignation. We'll get to the fact that this is merely shuffling the deck chairs in a moment, and she's not actually facing meaningful consequences here. But the fact that she's facing any consequences at all is really upsetting to the left. Certainly, They seem to think, or they definitely think, that you can commit any sin you like if you're on the side of justice. If you're on the right side, there really is no wrong way to act, including stealing other people's work.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. They've said that this is just a weapon. It doesn't actually count. That as opposed to being done by her academic colleague, since it was done by a colleague who she disrespects, Christopher Rufo, that it shouldn't even be submitted for consideration. They've even said that the term scalping, which some people have said they've claimed to scalp, is actually a racist term because it was something that white people used to cleanse American Indians, which is just absolutely historically inaccurate. It's no backing at all, but they don't mind that. And when in her own resignation letter, she blamed racism. She never even took credit for one of her mistakes. And it isn't just about skin color, like you said. It's a lot of this is about politics, because she personally, in her position before she was president, went after a young and rising, brilliant black economist who was at Harvard, the second youngest professor to ever be tenured at that university. And the reason why she went after him is almost certainly because of he had pushed back against the groupthink. He had published studies that said, hey, there's not really a lot of data to back up systemic racism in regards to police shootings. So even if you look the right way, if you think the wrong way, well, then you're in trouble with this group.
Yes, absolutely, and they're ruthless. There's no grace given at that point whatsoever if you're on the wrong side. And another piece on the idea that this is racism. Liz McGill was the president of the University of Pennsylvania. She was fired well over a month ago. Everyone's calling these resignations, but I think it's safe to say she was fired. She was canned over a month ago from the University of Pennsylvania. She gave the same answers to that congressional hearing to Elise Stefanik before Claudine Gay gave those answers. In other words, Claudine Gay copied yet another colleague in the academic world when she was testifying before Congress, but she wasn't canned until a month later. And so it's like ridiculous that you get Ibram X. Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones out there saying they only do this to black people. What are you talking about? You have to ignore Liz McGill's existence entirely.
I think it's safe to say, Vince, that if I had cost Harvard 17% decline in early admissions applications,
yes,
and I had alienated the top donors to the university, and I had overseen in my short tenure the biggest public relations disaster the university's had, and as long as I can recall, that I would have been fired before the new year began.
You'd be in solitary confinement with the January 6 inmates right now. You'd be.
And I don't think I would have $1 million professorship to land in.
Yeah. So what's the deal here? So let's talk about that aspect of this. All the headlines really were her resignation yesterday, and the left is acting as if she said that they said the conservatives are, quote, dancing on her grave. What kind of grave is she settling into?
It's a very comfortable grave, actually. It's practically a pharaoh levels. She's staying on as a member of the faculty at Harvard University, which, by the way, is a fairly prestigious gig, especially in Cambridge. It's a salary of around $900,000. So she gets to go back to exactly where she was before, essentially. Someone who was a bit of a hatchet man for the DEI, someone who didn't invent the system. We can't give her credit for that, but someone who benefited a great deal from the system. Someone who'd not published very many academic works. Every one of them that she's had published so far, there's been about 2 corrections per work, but every one of them has been about race, and they've all taken the right left-wing opinions. So she no longer gets the president's office at Harvard. She certainly hasn't been punished. At least, if that's punishment, then I would like to be next in line.
Yeah, exactly. I was saying the same thing. I just think it's so absurd, so preposterous. Do you think that this is the beginning of a sea change at these institutions? What comes next year? I do note that Christopher Rufo, who deserves credit for his work in trying to dig up so much of this successfully and share it with the public, has committed to establishing a fund to try and find even more examples of this type of plagiarism among all of these left-wingers who run these institutions. Do you expect more of that to come? Will there be any meaningful change at these places that are supposed to be educating rather than indoctrinating?
I'd like to see that, and there's certainly a lot of people, a lot of faculty at Harvard who have been communicating with each other. Every one of them has horror stories from either the administration, which is completely bloated, or the radical student body that they've overseen. I would certainly like to see that. I was encouraged by Bill Ackerman, the big top Harvard donor's tweets today, saying this goes a lot deeper with the problem. But of course, there's always some worries, because I was reading through Ackerman's tweet, and basically he kind of said, well, true diversity has never been tried yet. He didn't want to go too far. He didn't want to push too far on this and say, well, this is toxic, but really we still need to focus on all these other aspects of the left-wing agenda. I don't see that being solved, but the prestige to Harvard has taken a big hit. And over the past decades, there have been a lot of good groups out there, FIRE and others, who've been trying to fight the craziness that's going on campus, Young America's Foundation, but they've been fighting on a national level, and I think it's basically fighting a massive wildfire with a single garden hose. So now at Common Sense Society, we're in discussions with a couple different folks to try and keep the focus on the Ivy Leagues, because, well, there are fires at universities all over the country, state schools, community schools, everything. The Ivy Leagues, like you said, produced a lot of the leaders. They produced a lot of the top people, like it or not. And if you can focus on them and actually begin to affect change there, then hopefully a lot of the other schools will follow suit.
I will say I would love to see a database of Ivy League graduates and the cities they now run and what has happened under their tenures. I'd love to see that.
Not a bad idea.
I'd love to see, what, let's take a look at the real-world impact of what it means to churn out these kids into the world and to have them run all of America's cities. Like, how did that go? But we'll see. Well, hopefully that comes. In the meantime, thank you very much, Chris Bedford from the Common Sense Society magazine, the aptly named. Really appreciate your time today, sir.